What would you do if you came back to your inherited property after 3 years to find 27 vacation cabins built on your land by a neighbor claiming your dead grandfather gave him permission? That's exactly what happened to me, and the revenge I got was absolutely perfect. This story involves property theft, massive fraud, forged documents, and the most satisfying legal victory you'll ever hear. But here's the twist: this entitled neighbor had no idea that his greed and arrogance would end up making me rich beyond my wildest dreams. Trust me, you won't believe how this scheming criminal destroyed his own life trying to steal my family's land, and how I ended up owning everything he built with his own money. Let me start from the beginning, because this story gets more insane with every detail. Several years back, I inherited what can only be described as a piece of paradise from my beloved grandparents. This wasn't just any ordinary property. It was 40 acres of the most beautiful rural land you could imagine. Rolling green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see. There was a patch of old-growth forest that had been untouched for decades, and a crystal-clear creek that meandered through the back portion of the property like something out of a fairy tale. My grandfather used to tell me that this land was his piece of heaven on earth, and every time I visited as a child, I completely understood what he meant. There was something almost magical about the place. You could still see the weathered stone foundation where the original farmhouse had stood over a century ago. And there was this old windmill that creaked gently in the breeze like a heartbeat connecting us to generations past. The property had been in our family since the 1920s, when my great-grandfather first purchased it as a young farmer with big dreams. When I inherited the land, it took quite a bit of convincing to get my wife to agree to let me keep it instead of selling it immediately. She's a practical woman, and she pointed out that we already had a mortgage on our house in the city, two young kids with expensive activities, and her medical career was just getting started. The property was about 3 hours away from where we lived, and maintaining it would require time and money that we weren't sure we had. But there was something about that land that called to me. Maybe it was the connection to my family's history, or maybe it was the dream of eventually building our own house there and giving our kids the kind of childhood I had experienced during those magical summer visits to my grandparents' place. Whatever it was, I managed to convince her that we should hold on to it, at least for a few years while we figured out our long-term plans. We had grand visions of eventually building a beautiful new house on the property and moving there permanently once our kids were older, and my wife had established her medical practice. She was in the middle of a brutal hospital residency program that required her to work 80-hour weeks, and we both knew it would be at least 3 or 4 years before we could seriously consider relocating. The plan was to visit regularly, maybe spend some weekends there, and slowly start planning for our future dream home. See, the few times we did manage to visit during those early years, our kids absolutely loved every minute of it. They were young at the time, maybe 6 and 8 years old, and they would spend hours exploring every inch of the property. They'd wade through the shallow areas of the creek, catching minnows and building little dams with rocks. They'd point out perfect trees that could become tree houses someday, and they'd run through the open pastures with a freedom that city life just couldn't provide. Living in the city meant our kids spent most of their time in structured environment school, organized sports, supervised playdates in small backyards. But on that property, they could be real kids. They could climb trees, build forts, catch fireflies, and experience the kind of childhood that's becoming increasingly rare in our modern world. My wife and I would sit on the old porch steps in the evening, watching them play, and we'd talk about how perfect it would be to raise them there. Unfortunately, life had other plans for us. Things got incredibly busy, incredibly fast. Both kids got involved in multiple school activities that required us to be in the city almost every evening. Soccer practice, piano lessons, school plays, birthday parties, our weekends became just as packed as our weekdays. My job in software development started demanding longer hours as our company went through a major expansion, and my wife's residency was absolutely brutal. There were weeks when she'd work 7 days straight, coming home exhausted and barely able to stay awake for dinner. Before I knew it, months had passed without us visiting the property. Then those months turned into a year, then 2 years. I kept telling myself we'd get out there soon, maybe next weekend, maybe next month. But between my wife's impossible schedule, the kids' activities, and our own work demands, time just seemed to slip away from us like water through our fingers. I'm not proud to admit this, but nearly 3.5 years passed without me setting foot on that property. 3.5 years of paying property taxes on land I wasn't even visiting. 3.5 years of letting my grandfather's legacy sit empty while I got caught up in the chaos of modern life. If my grandparents were looking down on me during that time, I can only hope they understood how much I was struggling to balance everything. During those years of absence, I did occasionally think about the property. I'd get the annual property tax bills and feel a pang of guilt about not visiting. I'd see photos on social media of friends enjoying their weekend getaways and think about how we should be using our own piece of paradise. But somehow there was always something more urgent demanding our attention, always another reason to postpone the trip. Now, I need to tell you about my neighbor from that rural area because understanding his character is crucial to this story. This guy was one of those people who somehow managed to be both extremely unfriendly and uncomfortably intrusive at the same time. When I first inherited the property and was visiting regularly, he would always find excuses to come over and chat, but his conversations never felt genuine or neighborly. He had this cold, calculating way about him that made every interaction feel like an interrogation. He'd ask incredibly personal questions that went way beyond normal small talk between neighbors. I remember him asking detailed questions about what kind of insurance I carried on the property, whether my grandparents had ever run any kind of business from the land, and how often I planned to visit. At the time, I chalked it up to rural nosiness, but looking back, I realized he was systematically gathering intelligence. One conversation in particular stands out in my memory now, though it seemed innocent enough at the time. He mentioned almost casually that I could probably make good money building vacation rental cabins on my property. He talked about how popular rural getaways were becoming, especially with city folks looking to escape for weekends. He even mentioned specific rental rates he'd heard about in the area and suggested that with 40 acres, I could easily fit a dozen or more cabins without crowding the space. I took his comments as unsolicited business advice that was harmless enough. I thanked him for the suggestion, but explained that we weren't ready to make any major investments in the property yet. I thought that was the end of it. I had absolutely no idea that he wasn't just making casual conversation, he was planting seeds for a plan that he was already formulating in his scheming mind. What I didn't know at the time was that this neighbor had been watching my property carefully, noting how infrequently we visited, keeping track of when the grass got too long, observing that no one was maintaining the place. He was like a predator studying his prey, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. 3.5 years later, when I finally made the drive out to check on the property, I was expecting to find overgrown grass, maybe some fallen branches, perhaps some minor maintenance issues that had accumulated during my absence. What I found instead was something that made my blood run cold and my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. As I drove up the familiar gravel road that led to where my grandparents' old house had stood, I immediately noticed that something was very, very wrong. The landscape looked completely different. Large sections of the beautiful old trees were gone, replaced by cleared areas and what looked like buildings. Lots of buildings. I parked my car and got out, and that's when the full scope of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. Scattered across my family's property were 27 fully constructed vacation rental cabins. Not small, temporary structures, but substantial, professionally built cabins with real foundations, proper roofing, and what appeared to be full utilities. I actually counted them because I was in such complete shock that I needed to do something concrete to convince myself this was really happening. 27 cabins. Each one looked like it could sleep 4 to 6 people comfortably. They had covered porches, outdoor fire pits, and neat gravel driveways connecting them to a main road that definitely hadn't existed when I was last there. But here's what made it even more surreal. The cabins weren't empty. They were occupied. Smoke was curling up from several chimneys. Cars with out-of-state license plates were parked beside the cabins. I could see families on the porches, kids playing in the yards, people carrying fishing gear toward the creek. It was like I had stumbled into a fully operational vacation resort that had somehow materialized on my family's land. The infrastructure was extensive and obviously expensive. Someone had run electrical lines to every cabin, connecting them to the main power grid. There was a well system with pumps and storage tanks providing water to all the units. A shared septic system had been installed near the back of the property to handle waste from all 27 cabins. Gravel roads connected everything in a neat, organized layout that must have required significant planning and engineering. I just stood there in the middle of what used to be my grandfather's favorite meadow, hands on my head, trying to process what I was seeing. The financial investment alone must have been enormous. Building 27 cabins with full utilities and infrastructure would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Someone had essentially built a small town on my property while I was away. It took me several minutes of standing there in shock before I remembered my neighbor's casual suggestion about vacation rentals years earlier. And it took me even longer to spot him walking toward me from one of the cabins, wearing a satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. "Looks good, right?" he said, gesturing proudly at his creation like he was showing off a masterpiece. "I told you this place had potential." "You did this?" I managed to ask, though the answer was obvious. "I never gave you permission to build anything on my land. Your grandpa said I could handle the development," he replied with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation. It was a joint venture between us before he passed away. He knew the land wasn't doing anyone any good just sitting empty, and he wanted to see it put to productive use. "That doesn't sound like my grandfather at all," I said, my voice getting stronger as the initial shock began to wear off. "He loved this land exactly as it was, and even if he had made some kind of agreement with you, which I seriously doubt, do you have any papers he signed? Any documentation of this supposed partnership?" "It was more of a verbal agreement between neighbors," he said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. "Your grandfather was old school. He believed a man's word was his bond. But either way, I had his permission, and you should be thanking me instead of questioning me. I took all the financial risk, did all the work, and I'm willing to give you 5% of the profits for doing absolutely nothing. 5%. 5% of the profits from a business built entirely on my land with my family's resources." The audacity was breathtaking. I didn't give a damn about his generous offer of 5%. I was too angry about what he had done to even think about money at that moment. But as he continued talking, trying to justify his actions and convince me that I should be grateful for his initiative, I started taking pictures. Lots of pictures. I photographed every cabin, every utility line, every road, every sign. And there were signs, professional-looking signs with his rental business name, logo, phone number, and website. He had branded this operation like a legitimate business, complete with marketing materials. Each sign was evidence of his systematic theft of my property. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision or a simple misunderstanding. This was a carefully planned long-term operation that he had been developing for years while I was absent. When I got home that night, I immediately started organizing all the photos into folders on my computer, just in case this situation turned into a legal battle. But I also decided to do some research on my own, and what I discovered made me even more furious than I already was. I found his vacation rental website online, and it was extensive. Professional photos of all the cabins, detailed descriptions of amenities, booking calendars, customer reviews. This was a full-scale commercial operation. But here's what really got my blood boiling. The earliest customer reviews I could find dated back almost 3 full years. This guy had been running his illegal business on my land for nearly the entire time I had been absent. Even worse, when I looked at his advertised rates, I realized he had been lying to me about how much money he was making. He was charging guests significantly more than what he had told me during our conversation. Even at the 5% he was offering, he was trying to cheat me based on false numbers. By my rough calculations, based on his advertised rates and the occupancy levels I could estimate from customer reviews, he had probably generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue over those 3 years. And that was a conservative estimate. This guy had been getting rich off my stolen land while I was working my regular job and struggling to pay my own mortgage. When I confronted him again the next day, armed with printouts from his website, he had the nerve to tell me that he had obtained all the necessary building permits and that everything was completely legal. According to his new story, the area where he had built the cabins wasn't actually my land anymore because my grandfather had supposedly gifted it to him as part of their verbal agreement. So now, not only had my grandfather allegedly given him permission to build a vacation rental business, but he had also supposedly gifted him several acres of valuable property. I guess in death, my grandfather had become incredibly generous with land that had been in our family for nearly a century. I decided it was time to do some serious research into his claims about permits and legal ownership. I started by looking up property records at the county courthouse, and then I tried to get copies of his building permits through the state regulatory office, since he was refusing to show them to me directly. What I found was exactly what I expected, but even more extensive than I had imagined. The permits he had obtained listed him as the property owner, which should have been immediately flagged by the county since their own records clearly showed that I was the legal deed holder. But it turned out that the permitting office in that rural county was understaffed and still using partially paper-based systems that made it easier for fraudulent applications to slip through. He had submitted permit applications using fake parcel numbers that didn't trigger the county's automatic verification systems. On other documents, he had forged my grandfather's signature on permission letters, claiming that my grandfather had authorized the construction before his death. One of those forged documents even had an official notary seal. But when I investigated further, I discovered that the notary was a personal friend of his whose license had actually expired 2 years before the document was supposedly signed. The scope of the fraud was staggering. This wasn't just a case of someone taking advantage of an absent landowner. This was a systematic criminal enterprise involving forged documents, fake permits, fraudulent insurance claims, and probably tax evasion as well. I was angry, but I wasn't just in a blind rage. I was actually fascinated by the complexity of what he had done and curious to see exactly how many laws he had broken in the process. For someone who seemed so confident and appeared to be intelligent, he had made some incredibly stupid mistakes that showed his arrogance was going to be his downfall. That's when I decided it was time to bring in professional help. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in property law and rural land disputes, not one of those billboard attorneys you see advertising personal injury cases, but someone with real expertise in complex property fraud cases. I sent him everything I had discovered and explained the entire situation from beginning to end. When I finished telling him the story, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said slowly. This man built 27 vacation rental cabins on your property without any written permission, using forged documents to obtain building permits, and has been operating a commercial business on your land for 3 years without your knowledge or consent. That's exactly right, I confirmed. And he's claiming that my deceased grandfather gave him verbal permission to do all of this. The lawyer actually laughed at that. Verbal permission doesn't override recorded property deeds, he said. And even if your grandfather had given him some kind of permission, which clearly he didn't, that permission would have died with your grandfather. It wouldn't transfer to you as the new owner. But then my lawyer told me something that made this whole nightmare suddenly seem like it might have a silver lining. He explained something called the doctrine of accession, which I had never heard of before. In our state, this legal principle basically meant that when someone builds permanent structures on another person's land without permission, those structures can legally become the property of the landowner. It's designed to prevent people from being able to profit from trespassing and unauthorized construction. The way this typically works, my lawyer explained, is that the person who built without permission can sometimes be forced to remove their structures at their own expense. But in cases involving fraud and bad faith construction, especially on this scale, the courts often rule that everything stays and becomes the legal property of the rightful landowner. In other words, there was a very good chance that all 27 cabins, along with all the infrastructure he had built, would legally become mine.